The gavel cracked down like a slap across the face of the entire courtroom. "Get that woman out of my sight," Judge Marcus Holloway snapped, pointing a trembling finger at the janitor mopping quietly near the side entrance. "Do you not understand this is a courtroom? Not a garbage dump." Renata Cole did not look up. She kept mopping, slow and steady, as if the words hadn't touched her at all. But they had. Every syllable landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through a room that had gone completely silent. Clerks froze mid-motion. A young lawyer, briefcase still in hand, stared in disbelief. Two reporters covering an unrelated case exchanged a glance. The kind of glance that says, "Are you seeing this too? I asked you a question," Holloway barked, rising slightly from his bench, robe swishing with the motion. "Do you not have ears? Or do people like you simply not listen?" The words hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable. People like you. Everyone in the room understood exactly what he meant, even if no one dared say it out loud. Renata finally lifted her eyes. They were calm, unnervingly calm, the kind of calm that comes only after a person has survived far worse than a bully with a gavel. She said nothing. She simply moved her mop to the next tile. That silence infuriated him more than any response could have. "Bailiff," Holloway snapped, "escort this woman out immediately. I will not have my courtroom disrespected by someone who can't even be bothered to answer a direct question." A young bailiff named Peter Alvarez hesitated. He had seen Renata Cole in this courthouse for over a year. She arrived before sunrise, left after dark, never late, never careless, never anything but quietly excellent at a job most people ignored entirely. He had never once heard her raise her voice. But an order was an order. Reluctantly, he moved toward her. That was when something extraordinary happened. Renata straightened. She set her mop against the wall with the same unhurried calm she'd shown throughout the entire humiliation. She looked directly at Judge Holloway. Not with anger, not with fear, but with something far more unsettling, pity. "You should be careful, Your Honor," she said quietly, "about who you assume is beneath you." The room went utterly silent. Holloway's face reddened. "Is that a threat?" "No," Renata said. "It's a warning." She picked up her cleaning cart and walked out, unbothered, unhurried, leaving behind a room full of people who suddenly weren't sure what they had just witnessed. Judge Marcus Holloway sat back down, adjusted his robe, and muttered something about the nerve of some people, completely unaware that in exactly 11 days, his entire world was going to collapse. And it would collapse because of the very woman he had just thrown out of his courtroom like trash. What did she mean by a warning? And why did a janitor sound less afraid of a federal judge than the lawyers standing 3 feet away from her? To understand what was coming for Judge Holloway, you first had to understand who Renata Cole really was, and almost nobody in that courthouse actually did. For 14 months, she had been the quiet cleaning lady. She arrived at 5:15 every morning, always in the same simple gray uniform, always carrying the same worn canvas bag. She emptied trash bins, mopped floors, wiped down benches, and disappeared into hallways so easily that most staff couldn't have told you her last name if asked. Clerks assumed she'd always done this kind of work. Lawyers barely registered her presence at all. To them, she was furniture, necessary, invisible, unremarkable. None of them knew that 18 months earlier, Renata Cole had been the chief operating officer of Holbrook Meridian Industries, a logistics and manufacturing conglomerate worth over $4 billion. None of them knew she had once sat across boardroom tables from senators, negotiated multinational contracts, and been featured briefly, reluctantly, in a business magazine's list of rising executives to watch. And none of them knew why she had walked away from all of it. The truth was simple and devastating. She had discovered that the company's founder, a man she had once trusted like family, had been laundering money through shell subsidiaries and falsifying safety reports to cut costs. Reports that had, indirectly, contributed to a warehouse collapse that injured 11 workers. When she raised concerns internally, she was quietly pushed out, her reputation subtly poisoned in industry circles just enough that new opportunities dried up. Rather than fight a war she wasn't sure she could win, a war against a founder with money enough to bury any story, Renata disappeared instead. She sold her modest home, cut ties with a professional world that no longer trusted its own conscience, and chose invisibility. Cleaning felt honest. Felt like something that couldn't be corrupted. She didn't do it forever, though. She did it for exactly as long as it took her to quietly rebuild something else. Something few people knew about, tucked away in paperwork nobody had thought to check. Colleagues at the courthouse liked her, in the distant way people like someone they've never really spoken to. "She's sweet," one clerk said once. "Keeps to herself," said another. Nobody asked why a woman with impeccable posture and precise, deliberate movements was mopping floors instead of running boardrooms. Nobody except one retired court reporter, an elderly woman named Denise Whitfield, who had once done freelance business journalism decades ago. Denise had looked at Renata one afternoon, tilted her head and said, "You look familiar. Have we met before?" Renata had simply smiled. "I have one of those faces." But Denise hadn't been so sure. And she wasn't the type of woman who forgot things easily. Something was being hidden in that courthouse, and it wasn't just paperwork. If Judge Marcus Holloway had simply let the humiliation from that morning fade away, this story might have ended differently. But cruelty, once tasted, tends to crave more. 2 days after the courtroom incident, Holloway filed a formal complaint with courthouse administration, claiming Renata Cole had been insubordinate and verbally threatening toward him. He demanded her termination. The complaint was, to put it plainly, a fabrication dressed up in official language. Nothing in his own account matched what dozens of witnesses in that courtroom had actually seen. But Holloway had power, tenure, and connections, and Renata Cole on paper had none of those things. The head custodian, a tired, overworked man named Gary Booth, was called into an uncomfortable meeting. "I don't want trouble," Gary admitted privately to a coworker afterward. "But I've never seen her do anything wrong. Not once. Not ever." Still, pressure from a sitting judge is not something easily ignored. Gary was told to monitor the situation closely and file weekly reports on Renata's behavior. An absurd, humiliating demand for someone who had done nothing besides survive an unprovoked verbal attack. Holloway wasn't finished. The following week, he began making comments in open court, subtle at first, then increasingly blatant, mocking certain custodial staff who don't understand their place. Attorneys exchanged uncomfortable glances. Nobody challenged him. Judges, after all, hold enormous power over courtroom proceedings, and few professionals are willing to risk their careers pushing back against one. Then came the moment that crossed every remaining line. During a recess, Holloway approached Renata directly in a hallway, flanked by 2 clerks. "I know you're kind," he said, voice low enough that only those nearby could hear. "You think keeping your mouth shut makes you dignified. It doesn't. It makes you forgettable." Renata met his eyes steadily. "Some people mistake silence for surrender," she said. "It's rarely wise to make that mistake." Holloway laughed. A short, dismissive bark. "Is that another warning? Call it whatever helps you sleep at night, Your Honor." He turned and walked away, satisfied he'd put her firmly back in her place. He had, in fact, done the exact opposite. Witnesses in the hallway that day, including a young public defender named Marcus Aldridge, no relation to the judge, would later describe the exchange as chilling, not because Renata had raised her voice. She never did. But because of the quiet, immovable certainty in her tone, like a woman who wasn't afraid because she already knew how this story would end. That evening, Renata went home to her modest apartment, sat down at a small desk in the corner of her living room, and opened a laptop. She spent nearly 3 hours reviewing documents. Documents that had absolutely nothing to do with mopping floors. By midnight, she had sent 2 emails. One to a former colleague in corporate law. One to a state financial oversight office. Judge Marcus Holloway had just made an enemy out of the one person in that courthouse who actually had the power to end his career. He had absolutely no idea what was coming. 3 days after the hallway confrontation, an unusual envelope arrived at the courthouse administrative office. It wasn't addressed to any specific department, simply to property records. Inside was a formal notice. A change of ownership filing for the courthouse annex building, the very structure that housed Judge Holloway's courtroom. Nobody in administration understood it at first. City records had always listed the annex as municipally owned, part of a decades-old civic complex. But this filing referenced a private holding company, Cole Meridian Holdings, that had apparently acquired the building's title through a long-term lease-to-own agreement finalized months earlier. An administrative assistant named Priya Nair frowned at the paperwork. "This can't be right," she muttered, cross-referencing old city files. But the more she checked, the more she found. The lease-to-own arrangement was legitimate, filed correctly, notarized, and completely legal. The building's true ownership had quietly transferred from the city to a private entity nearly 4 months prior. And buried in the paperwork, listed as the holding company's sole managing member, was a name that made Priya's stomach drop. Renata M. Cole. Priya stared at the papers for a long moment, unsure whether to laugh or panic. Surely this was a clerical error. Surely there were 2 different Renata Coles. She wasn't the only one who noticed something strange that week. Denise Whitfield, the retired court reporter who had once done business journalism, had spent her evenings doing something she hadn't done in years. Research. That familiar feeling she'd had about Renata's face gnawed at her until she finally pulled up old archived business articles from nearly 2 years earlier. And there it was, a small photograph in a 5-year-old trade magazine, captioned, "Rising Executive Spotlight, Renata Cole, COO, Holbrook Meridian Industries." The woman in the photo wore a tailored blazer instead of a gray uniform. Her hair was styled differently, but the eyes, calm, unreadable, quietly formidable, were unmistakably the same. Denise sat back in her chair, heart pounding. "Oh my God!" she whispered to the empty room. "It's her." Meanwhile, the financial oversight office that Renata had emailed days earlier had begun a quiet preliminary review, not of the courthouse, but of Judge Marcus Holloway himself. Something in Renata's message had triggered concern serious enough to warrant a closer look at old case files, sealed settlements, and unusually generous rulings involving certain frequent litigants. Something was very wrong beneath the surface of Judge Holloway's courtroom. And it wasn't just about ownership of a building. It was about what that ownership was about to expose. What did Renata know? And how long had she been quietly building the exact leverage needed to bring a sitting judge to his knees? The full picture began emerging within days, and it was far larger and far darker than anyone in that courthouse could have imagined. Renata Cole's decision to purchase the courthouse annex hadn't been random. During her time at Holbrook Meridian, she had developed a reputation for something specific, forensic-level attention to financial irregularities. It was, in fact, exactly why she'd noticed the fraud that ended her corporate career in the first place. After leaving Holbrook, quietly rebuilding her finances through consulting work she conducted anonymously online, Renata had begun investing in undervalued municipal properties. Old building cities were eager to offload through creative financing arrangements. The courthouse annex had been one such property, purchased not out of some grand revenge scheme, but simple financial strategy. It was only after she began working there, deliberately, taking the janitorial position herself to observe quietly from the inside, that she noticed something troubling. Judge Marcus Holloway's courtroom had an unusually consistent pattern. Certain defense attorneys, representing certain wealthy or politically connected clients, won a suspicious number of favorable rulings. Settlement amounts in select civil cases were oddly generous. Evidence, in a handful of cases, seemed to mysteriously go missing or get ruled inadmissible on flimsy technical grounds. Renata hadn't taken the janitorial job to catch him. But once she noticed the pattern, she couldn't unsee it. And when he began humiliating her personally, escalating cruelty for no reason beyond casual bigotry, she realized she finally had both the motive and the access to do something about it. Working quietly at night, cross-referencing case filings she had cleaning access to review, communicating carefully with a trusted former colleague in corporate law, Renata built a private file. Bank transfer patterns. Suspicious timing between rulings and campaign donations to a state judicial re-election fund. A pattern of dismissed complaints against the same 3 law firms. It wasn't yet a smoking gun, but it was enough to hand to the right people. The State Financial Oversight Office, after receiving Renata's anonymous tip and now combined with property ownership revelations swirling through courthouse gossip, escalated their review into a formal